I held my daughter for exactly 7 minutes before they took her away forever. Or so I thought. The nurse had placed her in my arms. This tiny, wrinkled creature with a shock of black hair and fingers so small they couldn't wrap around my pinky. I was 16, exhausted, terrified, but in that moment, looking down at her perfect sleeping face, I felt something lock into place inside my chest. Something that felt like purpose, like love so fierce it hurt. I remember the weight of her. 6 pounds, 3 ounces, they'd told me. It felt both impossibly light and devastatingly heavy. This little person who'd lived inside me for 9 months, who I'd felt kick and hiccup and turn somersaults in the middle of algebra class. I traced the curve of her cheek with my thumb, marveling at skin so soft it seemed unreal. Her lips made tiny sucking motions in her sleep, and I wondered if she was dreaming, if newborns could dream, if she somehow knew I was her mother. "I'm going to take care of you," I whispered, my voice hoarse from screaming through contractions. "I promise." I looked up at my mother standing in the doorway, her face pinched with something I couldn't quite read. Worry, I thought, or maybe just exhaustion. It had been a long labor, 14 hours of my body trying to expel this person it had made. I asked. "It's standard procedure," the nurse said, already reaching for the baby. She had kind eyes but hands that moved with practiced efficiency, the kind that doesn't allow for hesitation or second thoughts. "We'll bring her right back." I didn't want to let go. My arms actually ached as the nurse lifted her away, and I remember thinking that was strange. My arms hurting more than the rest of my body after labor. The nurse smiled at me, one of those professional smiles that doesn't reach the eyes, and disappeared through the door with my baby. I watched the door close, counted the seconds, told myself they'd be right back. I never saw her again. The room felt emptier without her, like someone had opened a window and let all the air out. My mother sat beside the bed, took my hand, and I noticed hers was trembling. "Mom?" "Nothing, honey." But she wouldn't meet my eyes. My father came in then, bringing that hospital smell of antiseptic and fear with him. He'd been in the waiting room during the delivery. He couldn't handle seeing me in pain, he'd said. Now he sat on the edge of my hospital bed and took my other hand, and I knew before he spoke that something was catastrophically wrong. His face was gray, aged 10 years in the time it took for me to push a human being into the world. His eyes were red-rimmed, and when he opened his mouth to speak, nothing came out at first. My heart started hammering. "Where's the baby?" "There were complications," he said finally. "Mia, I'm so sorry. The baby?" The words didn't make sense. I heard them, understood them individually, but together, they formed something impossible. "What do you mean she didn't make it?" "She was fine. She was breathing." "Her heart," my father said, and I noticed he couldn't look at me either. "It just stopped. They tried everything." The world didn't shatter. It didn't explode. It simply stopped existing. I don't remember screaming, but my mother told me later that I did. I don't remember them sedating me, but I woke up hours later in a different room with an IV in my arm and a flatness in my chest where my heart used to be. What I do remember, with crystal clarity, was my mother sitting beside the bed, holding my hand, tears streaming down her face. "We'll get through this together," she whispered. "I promise, baby." But I didn't want to get through it. I wanted to die too. I wanted to follow my daughter wherever she'd gone, tell her I was sorry I'd let them take her away, sorry I hadn't protected her better. The next days blurred together. People came and went. Nurses, doctors, a hospital social worker who talked about grief counseling in a voice so gentle it made me want to scream. My parents handled everything. They signed paperwork, made arrangements, shielded me from decisions I was apparently too young and too traumatized to make. We held a funeral service 4 days later. A tiny white casket, closed, they said, because I shouldn't have to see her like that. My parents had arranged everything while I was still foggy from whatever they'd given me at the hospital. They'd picked out a dress for her, they told me. Something white with little flowers. They'd made sure she looked peaceful. Reverend Park from our church spoke about angels returning to heaven, about God's mysterious ways, about finding peace. I sat in the front pew, numb, my body present, but my mind somewhere else entirely. The church was half empty. Most people didn't know I'd even been pregnant. My parents had hidden it well, pulling me out of school halfway through junior year, telling people I was doing a semester abroad, studying in China with relatives. I was 16 years old, and I buried my daughter in a cemetery in Colma, where the graves stretched for miles in every direction. 20 years later, I opened an email that would prove every single word of that story was a lie. I was sitting at my desk in the Office of Family Services of San Francisco, where I'd worked as a social worker for the past 8 years. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I'd been reviewing case files for teenage mothers in the foster system. My specialty, my calling. The thing I'd built my entire career around. Helping young mothers keep their babies. Making sure they had resources, support, a fighting chance at making it work. I'd done the 23andMe test 6 months earlier, mostly out of curiosity about the health reports. My friend Jessica had been raving about discovering she had a genetic marker that explained her lactose intolerance, and in a moment of wine-fueled spontaneity, I'd ordered a kit. I'd honestly forgotten about it after spitting in the tube and mailing it back. The email itself was innocuous enough. 23andMe had found a match. I clicked through to my account, expecting maybe a third cousin or some distant relative in China I'd never heard of. Mother-daughter relationship, 9% probability. I stared at the screen, read it again, clicked back and forth between tabs, refreshed the page in case it was some kind of glitch. Sophie Chen. Age 20. Location: Sacramento, California. The name hit me first. Sophie. One of the names I'd considered during those long nights when I was 16, lying in bed with my hands on my belly, whispering to the person growing inside me. I'd made lists of names, crossing out and circling and imagining different futures. Sophie had been in my top 3. There was a message waiting. Hi, I know this might be surprising, but I've been searching for my birth family for 3 years. My adoptive parents always told me about my adoption, and they've been so supportive of me finding you. I was born on March 15th, 2005, at Mercy General Hospital in San Francisco. If you're willing to talk, I'd love to hear from you. I understand if you need time. Sophie, March 15th, 2005. The date was tattooed on my ribcage, hidden under my clothes where no one could see it. The date my daughter died. The date I'd mourned for 20 years, lighting a candle every year, taking the day off work to sit with my grief. The date that had shaped every decision I'd made since I was 16 years old. Except she hadn't died. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my laptop. The coffee I'd been drinking turned to acid in my stomach. I ran to the bathroom and vomited, then sat on the cold tile floor, my back against the stall door, trying to make my brain process what I'd just read. My daughter was alive. My daughter had been adopted. My parents had lied. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. "Mia?" Jessica's voice. "I'm fine," I managed. "Just feeling sick." I don't remember the drive home. I must have grabbed my things, must have walked to my car, must have navigated the streets of San Francisco to my apartment in the Mission, but I have no memory of it. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my couch, laptop open, staring at Sophie's message again. The profile picture showed a young woman with long, dark hair and high cheekbones. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back, and the resemblance was undeniable. She looked like me at 20. She looked like the daughter I'd imagined 10,000 times over the past 2 decades. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to shift across the floor? Long enough for my phone to buzz repeatedly with texts from Jessica checking on me. Long enough for the initial shock to crystallize into something harder, sharper. They told me she was dead. I mourned her. I struggled with depression, with survivor's guilt, with the specific torture of wondering if I could have done something different, if I'd eaten better during pregnancy, if I'd asked them to wait before taking her, if I'd been stronger, older, more capable. I'd chosen not to have other children because the thought of replacing her felt like betrayal. I'd built my entire career around helping young mothers keep their babies because I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else experiencing what I had. And she'd been alive the whole time. Somewhere in California, my daughter had been growing up, taking first steps, saying first words, starting school, learning to ride a bike, celebrating birthdays, living an entire life while I lit candles for her death. The fury that rose in me then was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was pure, incandescent, consuming. It burned through the shock and settled into my bones, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not rest until I understood exactly what had happened and who was responsible. I replied to Sophie's message with trembling fingers. "I need to talk to you as soon as possible." I left my phone number. She called within 5 minutes. Her voice was young, uncertain, hopeful. It cracked on the single word, and I heard my own tendency to cry when overwhelmed. That same wobble I got when emotions hit too hard and fast. I couldn't say anything else. Her name filled my mouth like a prayer, like an incantation, like a word that could remake the world. She asked, "I've imagined this conversation so many times, and now I don't know what to say." The words came out flat, factual, because if I let any emotion into them, I would shatter. "I held you for 7 minutes after you were born. I counted every second. And then they took you away and told me you died during complications. We had a funeral." Silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. "Oh my God," she whispered finally. "Oh my God. That you were young, 16. Her voice wavered. "They said it was an open adoption arrangement, but that you'd requested no contact until I was 18. They showed me paperwork with your signature on it, consent forms." "My signature? I never signed anything," I said, and my voice was steel now, every word deliberate. "I never agreed to any adoption. Sophie, I wanted you. I wanted to keep you. I had plans. I'd found listings for apartments we could afford. I was going to get my GED, work at my cousin's restaurant, save money for community college. I'd figured it all out in my head. She started crying then, and so did I, and we stayed on the phone for 3 hours. She told me about her childhood in Sacramento, about her adoptive parents, Mark and Jennifer, who'd loved her fiercely, given her everything. About her life as a college junior at UC Davis studying environmental science. She told me about always feeling like there was a piece missing, even though her adoptive family was wonderful. About the questions that had always gnawed at her, about needing to know where she came from. I told her about being 16 and terrified, but determined. About the tiny apartment listings I'd circled in the newspaper with red marker. About working out budgets on notebook paper during study hall. About the names I'd picked out. Sophie was one of them, and when I told her this, she gasped. About the 7 minutes I'd held her, memorizing her face, the exact weight of her in my arms, the way her fingers had curled against my chest. About promising her everything would be okay. About the funeral where I'd said goodbye to an empty casket. I need to see the adoption paperwork, I said finally, when we'd both cried ourselves out. All of it. They're good people, Sophie said quickly, defensively. They didn't know. I believe you, but someone knew. Someone facilitated this. Someone looked at a 16-year-old girl and decided to steal her baby and let her think she was dead. The next day, I called in sick to work, genuinely sick with the kind of illness that comes from your entire reality being rewritten overnight. Then I drove to Sacramento. Sophie met me at a coffee shop near the UC Davis campus. I got there early, ordered a coffee I couldn't drink, and sat by the window watching every person who walked by. Would I recognize her? Would she look like me? Would I feel that pull of recognition, that mother's instinct I'd been told about? Then she walked through the door, and the moment I saw her, my knees buckled. She looked like me at 20, same dark hair falling past her shoulders, same high cheekbones and narrow chin, same way of tucking hair behind her left ear when nervous. She did it twice just walking across the coffee shop. She had her father's eyes, Ryan's eyes, deep-set and hazel. The only thing she'd inherited from the boy who'd ghosted me the moment I told him I was pregnant. But everything else was mine. We stood in the middle of the coffee shop and hugged for a long time, both of us crying, while baristas and customers pretended not to stare. She smelled like vanilla shampoo and laundry detergent, familiar and foreign all at once. "You're real," she kept saying. "So are you," I said, and laughed through my tears because what else could I do? Her adoptive parents, Mark and Jennifer, met us at their house that evening. They lived in a beautiful craftsman in East Sacramento with a garden full of roses and a porch swing where Sophie said she'd spent countless hours reading. They were in their 50s, warm and welcoming, even as confusion and concern clouded their faces. Jennifer kept touching Sophie's shoulder, as if reassuring herself her daughter was still there, that this new information hadn't somehow erased the previous 20 years. We went through an agency called New Beginnings Adoption Services, Mark explained, spreading paperwork across their dining room table. Legal documents, medical records, birth certificates. They were recommended by our attorney. We'd been trying to adopt for 3 years. Everything seemed legitimate. I stared at the documents with a social worker's trained eye, looking for discrepancies. consent to adopt forms, relinquishment papers, all dated March 17, 2005, 2 days after Sophie was born. There was my signature. Mia Chen, written in handwriting that looked almost like mine, but wasn't quite. The letters were too loopy, the slant slightly off. I'd spent years after Sophie's death journaling, trying to process my grief, and I knew my own handwriting intimately. This wasn't it. "This is forged," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "I never signed this. 2 days after she was born, I was sedated in a hospital bed, being told my baby was dead." Jennifer's face went white. She reached for Mark's hand. "Oh God, we had no idea. The agency told us you were 16, that you'd decided adoption was best, that you wanted a closed arrangement. They had all the documentation. We paid them $40,000. "Did you ever meet anyone from the agency?" "Once," Mark said. He shuffled through papers, found a business card. "For the initial consultation. It was in a medical building in San Francisco near Union Square. Very professional. Clean office, friendly staff." He handed me the card. I photographed every document with my phone, hands steady now despite the rage building in my chest. Birth certificates. There were 2, I noticed. One that listed me as mother, no father listed, and a second, amended one listing Mark Chen and Jennifer Chen as parents. Hospital records from Mercy General, signed by nurses whose names I didn't recognize. The consent forms with my forged signature. And there, in the corner of one document, a stamp I recognized. The seal from Dr. Morrison's practice. Dr. James Morrison, my family's physician since I was 5 years old. The doctor who'd delivered Sophie. The doctor who'd supposedly signed her death certificate. The doctor who'd come to the funeral and hugged my parents and told them how sorry he was for their loss. My hands started shaking again. "I need to go," I said abruptly, standing. "Sophie, can we meet tomorrow?" She nodded, understanding somehow that I was barely holding myself together, that if I stayed one more minute, I would either scream or collapse or both. I drove to my parents' house in San Francisco, a house in the Sunset District where I'd grown up, where I'd lived during my pregnancy, where I'd returned from the hospital without my daughter. It was after 9 p.m., but their lights were on. They'd always been night owls, staying up late watching Chinese dramas or reading. My mother answered the door in her bathrobe, surprise flickering across her face. "Mia, what's wrong? You look terrible." I pushed past her into the house, into the familiar living room with its jade plant by the window, and the sofa where I'd spent so many hours crying after the funeral. "Where's who?" "Mia, you're scaring me." "Where is my daughter? The one you told me was dead?" My father appeared in the hallway, and the expression on his face told me everything I needed to know. Not surprise, not confusion, not the shocked concern of an innocent person being accused of something unthinkable. Guilt. Pure, undisguised guilt. His voice was quiet, resigned, like he'd been waiting 20 years for this moment. My mother's face crumpled. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. The confirmation somehow hurt more than the discovery. Part of me had hoped for some impossible explanation, some terrible mistake that would make this okay. That would mean my parents hadn't deliberately, consciously stolen my child and let me suffer for 2 decades. My voice shook, but I pushed through. "You let me grieve her. You held a funeral with an empty casket. You watched me fall apart for 20 years and you said nothing." My mother cried. Her face was red now, defensive. "You were a child yourself. You had your whole life ahead of you. College, career, a real future. She was my child, my daughter." My father's voice rose to match mine. Dropping out of school, working minimum wage jobs, struggling to survive, living in some tiny apartment with no money, no support, no future. We gave her a better life, a real family, 2 parents who could provide for her, give her opportunities, send her to college. "You gave me nothing." I was shaking so hard I had to sit down on the couch where I'd cried myself to sleep so many nights. "How did you do it?" Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. My father sank into his armchair, the one he'd sat in every night for as long as I could remember. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, smaller somehow. "Dr. Morrison, he was at the hospital when you gave birth. He knew people. There was a nurse, the one who took the baby from you." An arrangement for young mothers for families who wanted what was best. The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. My mother's face flushed dark. "We didn't get any money. We never took money. We knew people who could help place babies with good families. Families who'd been vetted, who desperately wanted children. Dr. Morrison handled everything. He said it was better this way, cleaner." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The look on my mother's face told me she'd never thought about it that way, had never considered that aspect of the lie she'd helped construct. "The funeral," I said, my voice hollow now. "Nothing," my father whispered. "It was empty. We couldn't let you see. We had to make it real." I stood up. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but they carried me toward the door. "I'm going to the police. I'm going to find every single person involved in this, and I'm going to make sure they all pay for what they did. Every single." My mother reached for me, tried to grab my arm. "We're your parents. We love you." I shook her off, looked at both of them standing there in their comfortable living room, in their comfortable house built on 20 years of comfortable lies. Parents don't steal their grandchildren. Parents don't let their children suffer for decades over a lie they created. Parents don't choose reputation over their daughter's fundamental right to mother her own child. You're strangers who look like the people who raised me. I left them there and drove home in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I called a lawyer, then the police. Then I started digging, and I didn't stop until I'd unearthed every single rotten piece of the conspiracy that had stolen my daughter. The investigation took 4 months, and every day revealed new layers of betrayal that made the initial horror seem almost quaint by comparison. Dr. Morrison's arrangement turned out to be part of a massive coerced adoption scheme that had been operating for over 25 years, spanning 3 decades and involving dozens of medical professionals, adoption agencies, and lawyers. New beginnings. Adoption services was a front for what was essentially human trafficking, targeting young, vulnerable mothers, pressuring them to give up their babies, and in cases like mine, outright stealing infants and falsifying deaths. The detective assigned to my case, Maria Santos, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a steel spine. She'd been working SVU for 15 years and had seen her share of horror, but even she seemed shaken by what we uncovered. "Your case is unique because you actually found your daughter," she told me during one of our many meetings. "Most of these women have no way to locate their kids. The records were deliberately obscured, birth certificates altered, trails covered. You got lucky with DNA testing." Through Detective Santos, we found 17 other cases just in Northern California. 17 other mothers who'd been told their babies died, only to discover years later, if they discovered at all, that their children had been adopted out through the same network. The youngest victim had been 14. The oldest was 19. Most, like me, had been unmarried teenagers whose families wanted to hide the shame of teen pregnancy. One woman, Carmen Rodriguez, had been told her twin boys died at birth. She'd grieved for 30 years before a chance encounter with one of her sons at a grocery store. He was the cashier, and she'd noticed his unusual birthmark that matched her family. DNA tests confirmed what she'd felt in her gut. That was her child, alive and grown, with a brother somewhere she still hadn't found. We filed criminal charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, falsifying government documents, violation of parental rights. The charges extended to my parents, Dr. Morrison, the nurse who'd taken Sophie from my arms. Her name was Diane Chen, no relation, which felt like its own twisted irony. Patricia Knowles, who'd run New Beginnings, and 6 other people involved in various aspects of the scheme. The civil suits came next: emotional distress, loss of parental consortium, violation of civil rights. The lawyer I'd hired, Margaret Wu, specialized in adoption trauma, and she was absolutely ruthless in depositions. "They didn't just take your baby," she explained during one of our meetings in her downtown office. "They stole your identity as a mother. They stole 20 years of memories, birthdays, first words, first steps, graduations, relationship, everything. That has value, quantifiable, compensable value." My parents tried to call me 847 times over those 4 months. I know because I counted, keeping a meticulous log the way I'd kept everything else about Sophie. Her birthday marked on every calendar, her footprints from the hospital that I'd framed, the tiny hospital bracelet they'd given me that I'd kept in a box by my bed. They sent letters that I burned without reading, watching the paper curl and blacken in my sink. They showed up at my apartment twice before I threatened a restraining order. My mother stood outside my door crying, begging me to listen, to understand, to forgive. I didn't open the door. The only communication I accepted was through lawyers. Everything documented, everything on record. The case went public in month 3 when one of the other victims, a woman named Lisa Chen, we joked darkly about the abundance of Chens in this tragedy, gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle. Local news picked it up first, then national. I did an interview with Sophie beside me, both of us holding hands as I recounted the whole story for the cameras. The response was overwhelming. Other mothers came forward with similar stories from different agencies, different doctors, different cities. Adoptees started questioning their own adoptions, looking at paperwork with fresh suspicion. The FBI got involved, expanding the investigation nationwide. Suddenly, this wasn't just about San Francisco. It was a nationwide network of coerced adoptions that had been operating for decades. Sophie and I spent almost every weekend together during those months. We were building something entirely new, Not a traditional mother-daughter relationship, because how could we be? She already had a mother, and I'd missed 20 years of mothering. But we were building something else, something precious and fragile and worth fighting for. She told me about her childhood, showing me photo albums on her phone, her first day of kindergarten, her at a soccer game with grass-stained knees, her high school graduation in cap and gown. And I grieved every single moment I'd missed while simultaneously celebrating every moment she'd been loved. Her adoptive parents, Mark and Jennifer, had given her a beautiful childhood, and I was grateful for that, even as it broke my heart that it hadn't been me. Mark and Jennifer became unexpected allies in all of this. They'd been victims too, they realized, manipulated into spending their life savings on what they'd believed was a legitimate adoption. They'd loved Sophie with their whole hearts, and now they had to grapple with the fact that their joy had been built on my stolen grief. "We love her," Jennifer told me during one particularly difficult meeting where we were all trying to figure out what our new family structure looked like, how to navigate holidays and introductions, and the simple question of what Sophie should call everyone. "We've raised her, and we'll always be her parents. We earned that through every scraped knee we bandaged, every nightmare we soothed, every school play we attended. But she should have had you too. You should have been able to choose what role you played in her life, if any. The choice should have been yours." That was it exactly. Choice. They'd stolen my choice, my agency, my fundamental right to decide my own future. The trial started in October, 11 months after Sophie's first message. I testified for 3 days, recounting every detail of Sophie's birth, the lies I'd been told, the decades of grief. The defense attorney tried to rattle me, asking why I hadn't questioned the story more, why I'd simply accepted my parents' word. "I was 16, I said, looking directly at the jury. I'd just given birth. I was exhausted and traumatized and pumped full of sedatives, and they were my parents. They were the people who'd raised me, who I trusted more than anyone in the world. Why would I think they were lying?" Sophie testified about growing up always feeling like something was missing, about the trauma of discovering her entire origin story was based on lies, about the identity crisis of realizing she was the product of something criminal. "I don't blame my adoptive parents," she said clearly, looking at Mark and Jennifer in the gallery. "They're innocent in this, but I do blame every adult who participated in taking me from my birth mother. Every person who decided that her age made her unfit to make her own decisions." 17 other mothers testified. Some had never stopped looking for their supposedly dead babies, spending decades searching obituaries and hospital records, never quite able to let go of the feeling that something was wrong. Others had tried to move on, only to be shattered by discoveries like mine: DNA tests, chance encounters, deathbed confessions. Dr. Morrison's lawyer tried to argue he'd been providing a service, helping babies get into good homes, saving young mothers from lives of poverty and struggle. The prosecutor destroyed that argument by presenting evidence of the massive fees charged, up to $50,000 per adoption, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable young women, the systematic falsification of death certificates and government records. "This wasn't charity," the prosecutor said in closing arguments. This was a business built on stealing children and selling them to the highest bidder while telling mothers their babies were dead. That's not help. My parents' lawyer took a different approach. They'd been misguided but well-intentioned. They genuinely believed they were protecting me, giving me a future, sparing me from hardship. I watched my father on the stand, gray and shrunken, explaining how he'd thought he was doing the right thing. I wanted her to have a future, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't want her tied down at 16 with a baby she couldn't afford to raise. I grew up poor. I know what that's like. The prosecutor asked. We thought she'd heal. And when she didn't, my father's voice broke. I told myself every year I'd tell her the truth. Every year on her birthday, every Christmas, every time I saw how much pain she was in. And every year, it seemed easier to keep the lie. The lie became the truth. I felt nothing watching him cry. That scared me more than the anger had. I should have felt something, rage, vindication, even pity, but there was just emptiness where my father used to live in my heart. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Dr. Morrison got 15 years in federal prison. Patricia Knowles got 20. The nurse, Diane Chen, got 10 years with possibility of parole after 5. My parents each got 12 years. When the verdict was read, my mother collapsed in the courtroom, wailing. My father sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I watched them being led away in handcuffs, these people who'd raised me, who'd taught me to tie my shoes and ride a bike, who'd helped me with homework and driven me to piano lessons. And I felt nothing at all. The civil suits settled 6 months later. $7 million to be distributed among the 17 mothers involved in the criminal case, with additional funds allocated to the nonprofit I'd started, Found Voices, supporting mothers who'd been victims of coerced adoption and facilitating ethical reunion services for adoptees. The money couldn't fix anything, couldn't give me back 20 years, but it could pay for therapy, for Sophie, for me, for all of us trying to stitch together identities from the scraps of truth we'd finally uncovered. It could fund advocacy work, lobby for legislative changes, prevent this from happening to anyone else. Sophie and I continued building our relationship, careful and intentional. We talked every few days. We celebrated holidays together, sometimes just us, sometimes with Mark and Jennifer, creating new traditions that honored all parts of her complicated family tree. On her 22nd birthday, we went to the beach again, this time to Santa Cruz, walking along the boardwalk, eating saltwater taffy and watching seals sun themselves on the rocks. Sophie said, sitting on a bench overlooking the water. She said it quickly, nervously. I know you said I already have a mom, and I do, and Jennifer will always be my mom. But I was thinking, maybe I could have 2? My throat closed up. If you're comfortable with it, I know we missed a lot of time, and I know we're still figuring out what we are to each other. But you're my mother. Biologically, yes, but also, you fought for me. Even 20 years later, you fought to find the truth and get justice. I pulled her into a hug, both of us crying again because that seemed to be our default setting lately. I would be honored, I whispered into her hair. 3 years after that first DNA notification, I stood in a California State Assembly committee hearing room, Sophie beside me, testifying in favor of new legislation we'd helped draft. The Stolen Mothers Act, they were calling it, though the official name was more bureaucratic. It would require DNA testing before any infant death certificate could be issued, create a searchable database for adoptees seeking birth families, mandate criminal penalties for coerced adoption, and establish oversight for private adoption agencies. My daughter and I lost 20 years, I told the committee, my voice steady now, practiced from dozens of similar testimonies. 20 years of memories, of relationship, of choice. We can't get that back, but we can make sure no other mother has to light birthday candles for a living child. Some of the legislation passed. Not all of it. There was pushback from adoption agencies, from conservatives worried about abortion implications, from people who genuinely believed adoption was always the better choice. But we got enough. Criminal penalties for falsifying birth records, better oversight, a searchable database. It was a start. I never spoke to my parents again. They sent letters from prison that I filed away unread in a box in my closet. Maybe someday I'd be ready to open them. Maybe not. I decided I didn't owe them my forgiveness any more than they'd owed me the truth. What I owed was to Sophie, to myself, to the hundreds of other mothers and children still searching for each other in the wreckage of a broken system. 5 years after Sophie found me, we stood together at a press conference announcing the successful reunification of the last of the identified stolen baby cases from our investigation. 43 mothers and children reconnected through DNA databases, investigative work, and the network of advocates we'd built. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashed. I'd gotten used to this part, the public face of private grief, the way trauma became testimony, became advocacy. A reporter asked. I thought about the 16-year-old girl I'd been, holding her daughter for 7 minutes and believing she would see her again soon. About the 20 years of grief that had followed, the candles lit and the tears cried, and the therapy sessions spent trying to understand why I'd failed to save my child. About the moment I'd seen Sophie's message and felt my entire reality crack open like an egg. About all the mothers still searching, all the children still wondering, all the families torn apart by people who thought they knew best. Sophie slipped her hand into mine, squeezed gently. I want people to know that some things can't be stolen forever, I said, looking directly into the cameras. They tried to take my daughter, my choice, my identity as a mother. They thought if they buried the truth deep enough, it would stay buried. They staged a funeral, created fake documents, enlisted doctors and lawyers and nurses in their conspiracy. I paused, made sure I had everyone's attention. But truth has a way of surfacing. Love has a way of persisting across decades and lies and even grief. And justice, real justice, is built not on revenge, but on making sure no one else has to live the lie we survived. It's built on believing mothers when they say they want their children. It's built on respecting a woman's choice, whether she's 16 or 60. Sophie stepped beside me, wrapped her arm around my waist in a gesture that had become natural over years of building this relationship, one careful conversation at a time. And I want people to know that being found is just the beginning, she added. We lost 20 years, but we have the rest of our lives to build something new, something true, something they can never take away. Every birthday we celebrate together, every holiday, every random Tuesday phone call to talk about nothing important. Those are ours now. Those belong to us. We walked away from the podium together, mother and daughter, connected not just by DNA, but by the choice we made every single day to show up for each other, to build bridges across the void of stolen time, to transform trauma into purpose. They'd tried to bury our story with lies and empty caskets and falsified documents. Instead, we'd made sure everyone heard it, and we'd made damn sure it could never happen again.